Hello, and welcome to Bio24. This is Cheryl Hackworth, and I'm going to be your instructor this semester. We're going to start this semester by beginning with an Introduction to Biology lecture, wherein we'll be talking about foundations of biology, just basic information that you'll need in order to understand a little bit more about each lecture that we're going to cover this semester. As a few notes before we begin. Each lecture is going to be made up of different parts. Make sure you watch all of the parts of every lecture before completing your assignments and quizzes. Also, if you haven't taken a look at the assignments that you're going to be required to do this semester, you may not know that you're required to take notes on every single lecture that you watch. So to get a head start on your assignments, I would recommend that you open up a Word document file right now and start taking notes on the lecture as we begin. That way, you'll be ahead of schedule, even as you're watching the lecture today. Let's begin. The first thing that I want to cover is cells. All life is made up of cells, and cells are the smallest unit of life. When we talk about cells, there are only really two major types. There are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. The biggest difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells is that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, whereas eukaryotic cells do. The nucleus is defined as a membrane region that contains DNA, and you can see that right here. Prokaryotic cells do have DNA, but the DNA is floating freely inside the cytoplasm and is not surrounded by a membrane. This region is referred to as the nucleoid, but because it's not surrounded by a membrane, it is not considered a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are called prokaryotic cells because they existed before the nucleus evolved. Pro meaning before and karyote meaning kernel or nucleus. Eukaryotic cells evolved after prokaryotic cells, and they contain the membrane-bound region that contains DNA, called the nucleus, and that's why they're called eukaryotic. Eu meaning true, and karyote meaning kernel or nucleus. So they have a true nucleus, whereas prokaryotic cells do not. There are some other differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. In addition to lacking a nucleus, prokaryotic cells are also very small. They're roughly 10 times smaller than eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are things like bacteria, and if you've heard of them, archaea. They are considered to be the first life on Earth to have evolved, and they, in addition to being smaller, are also a little less complex. They don't have a lot of internal structures to them, internal structures that we call organelles, and they are also all unicellular organisms, meaning every single organism that is prokaryotic is made entirely of one cell. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are much larger, roughly 10 times larger. In addition to having the nucleus, they also have lots of organelles, and you can see an assortment of them here in this picture. All of these different organelles are membrane-bound regions that have a specific function. In addition to all those things, eukaryotic cells can also be unicellular or multicellular. Some examples of unicellular eukaryotes are things like Giardia, malaria, amoebas, protozoa. If you've heard of any of these things, those are all unicellular eukaryotic cells. Yeast and green algae are also eukaryotic and unicellular. But eukaryotic cells can also be comprised of multicellular organisms. Things like animals, plants, mushrooms, and other types of fungi are all multicellular eukaryotic organisms. Now, all life is considered to be related. You look more like your closest relatives, and organisms that have similar appearance, and also similar DNA sequences are considered to be more closely related. We use that same idea not only within families or within species, but also between species. So the more similar an organism looks to another, the closer the relationship. We also find this in their DNA as well, that DNA is shared within family lines and also between species. This concept that we're detailing here is the concept of evolution. Evolution is the concept that every generation is going to be really similar to the preceding one with some small changes. This is understood in the concept of descent with modification. That's essentially what evolution is that life changes very slowly over time. As a result of this concept, we could then say that all organisms share a common ancestor. So when we talk about these prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, we can say that eukaryotic cells evolved from prokaryotic cells. We can see this in different features that we find in organisms. Things like DNA comparisons can show us similarities between organisms. Also, the fossil record indicates these similarities and relationships. And similar anatomy is another way that we can document and have evidence for the evolution of species. Now, while we understand that evolution occurs and life changes slowly over time, it was only recently, in the last few hundred years, that we had a better understanding of how it occurred. The concept of how evolution occurs is understood in the theory of natural selection. Many students know this as the concept of survival of the fittest. Natural selection and evolution are not the same thing. Evolution is just that life changes over time, whereas natural selection is how this works. Survival of the fittest is essentially the concept that says the organisms that are best suited to survive and reproduce are going to be the organisms that will comprise future generations. In this concept, when we say survival of the fittest, we don't use the term fit to describe athletically or physically fit. We use the term fit in biology to describe an organism's ability to reproduce. So being biologically fit really means an organism's ability to reproduce. Humans have been manipulating evolution for our own purposes, and we do this in the concept of artificial selection. One of the classic and oldest cases of artificial selection, or humans manipulating evolution, is with dogs. The very first time humans manipulated evolution for their purpose was when they started hanging out with wolves and eventually started manipulating wolf breeding. Eventually you get things like Chihuahuas and Bichon Frises and wolfhounds and greyhounds. All these assortments of dogs are still part of the same species and still belong to the same species as wolves do. So you can still get a wolf-dog hybrid. However, we've done this in many different ways subsequent to the evolution and change of dogs. We've also manipulated the evolution of lots of organisms, especially those of plants. Most of the foods that we eat are not naturally found in nature, but rather are a human-bred alternative to what you can find in nature. Things like peppers and corn, wheat, lots of different foods that we eat are altered from their original version. This is all referred to as artificial selection. In artificial selection, humans choose the traits that they want to see in future generations, and there is a goal in mind. In natural selection, there is no goal in mind, and organisms that are able to reproduce the best and the most are what are seen in future generations.